Anyway, welcome back for the second day of the state-of-the-art New Directions in Sexuality Education Current Social Science Theories and Practice Symposium. So it's great to see you all back here, and it was nice to see some of you at the dinner last night and meet some of you that came out for drinks last night too, and some of you that came to the opening of the Pride Art Show. That was really awesome. So in line with the new... Achoo. Sneeze away. So it gives me great pleasure in the for the keynote panel to start our day today to have Jean Gilbert here from York University and Jessica Fields from San Francisco State. And so one of the things that I sort of wanted to do with this symposium was kind of get out of this rut of how terrible everything is and think of initiatives that are really kick-starting and rebooting what else sexuality education writ large could be. And I suppose that I see the work that Jen and Jessica have done and are continuing to do with the Beyond Bullying project is a really exciting initiative in that way. So their presentation is called Sexuality Education Beyond the Classroom and Beyond Intervention. Lessons from the Beyond Bullying project. It's a real privilege to have you both here. I love hanging out with you and talking. It always feels so productive and exciting. So it's special to have you here, and so welcome, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks.
And so I thought the way that it might roll is that they will present and then we will talk. Yeah? Does that sound okay? Yeah. Awesome.
So thanks so much for having us, Kathleen, for being such a good colleague and friend and host, always. Thank you. We're presenting work today that we've done with Laura Mamo, who's also at San Francisco State University, and Nancy Lesko, who's at Teachers College, Columbia University, and they help to design and implement and conduct and do the analysis. So they are here in spirit and on page and on screen. And we'll be happy to share with them what we learn here. We always have good conversations about our work when we come to New Zealand and when we're with our Australian and New Zealand colleagues. And we always leave smarter, and we always are impressed, really, with the conversations and how they've shifted here in ways that they haven't always in North America, and are looking forward to the conversation about this project as well. We're presenting work from a paper that's forthcoming in Harvard Ed, and so you can also get a copy of it in a couple of months, maybe, I guess. I'm not sure.
Maybe
soon.
3 weeks soon. Yeah.
So it's in process. So that'll be out, and we're happy to share it with you if you're interested after we're done. Okay, and we're going to take turns and share slides and videos. Okay.
I'll try to, if I forget a slide, remind me. I know, but it says slide, highlighted in yellow.
So easy to lose.
Okay. In 2000, already did it. Oh, no, that was, okay. Well, it's unclear. I mean, okay. In 2014, soon after the Beyond Bullying Project set up our storytelling booth in the courtyard of West High School in San Francisco, we met Randy, a mixed-race, gregarious, slightly awkward first-year student. That's the booth there. Randy seemed to wander through the school, not settle into any class, activity, or course of study, neither hiding nor trying to leave. Our booth, meant to collect stories of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer sexuality and gender from students, teachers, and staff over the next 2 weeks, would become her temporary home base. On that first day, she expressed interest in telling a story about losing friends when she came out as a lesbian in grade 8. Evan, a racially mixed gay staff member in the school's wellness center and leader on LGBTQ issues at West High, greeted Randy when he brought another student to the booth to tell a story. Evan played an active role in supporting students like Randy, queer and on the edge of the school community. Having spent months trying to convince Randy to attend class, Evan pointed to Randy and said to our team, "This is what truancy looks like." And indeed, across our 2 weeks at West High, several teachers came to the booth, found Randy, and walked her back to class. For her part, Randy insisted, "I don't feel like school's for me." Evan speculated later that gay boys head downtown to escape school and hang out with street-involved gay youth, but queer girls stick around. walk other girls to class, and flirt. We watched Randy do just that, escort young women to and from our booth, and later offer to accompany us on our presentations about the project in various classes. In her interview, she described avoiding her own classes, even as she regularly attended her friend's health class because the friend didn't want to go alone. She should have just registered for that class. Educational research has convincingly demonstrated that LGBTQ youth are at risk of academic failure. Reading Randy's school experience through this research, we might notice chronic absences and stunted achievement. And yet, as important as it is to document the challenges that LGBTQ youth face in school, other understandings of Randy's experience are in danger of getting lost behind concern for her truancy. Being a lesbian brings Randy to school, secures the attention and care from Evan and other adults, inspires her to walk her friends to class, and allows her to spend her days expressing and enjoying her same-sex desires. To see her identity only through concerns about academic failure is to obscure the desires and relationships that queerness makes possible for Randy and the school's role in supporting and undermining those multiple and contradictory desires and relationships. Our study invited Randy, Evan, and other students, teachers, and staff to share stories of LGBTQ sexuality and gender, and thereby produce intimate possibilities, stories of who they are, who they want to be, and the social worlds they want to build. This turn towards stories builds on Ken Plummer's insistence that sexuality takes the form of personal, relational, and gendered stories, representing and reflecting shared and implicit norms, ideas, and structures, while also shaping the discourse of LGBTQ lives by naming individual and collective sexual possibilities. Telling and hearing stories allow people to author the self and to recognize the intersecting lives of people, families, and communities, even as those same stories gesture towards spaces beyond current social and linguistic conventions. Stories also have the capacity to produce change in LGBTQ lives by producing possibilities for belonging and recognition, and by showing how one person's experiences, memories, hopes, fears, and desires connect with others across generations, racialized and gendered categories, relationships, and geographies. By offering shades of meaning and feeling, stories in schools foster affective experiences of belonging and recognition impossible in didactic lessons that aim to stem bullying, advance sexual health, or promote tolerance. As Kristen D'Alessandro and Amy Wilkins suggest, the opportunity is twofold. Quote, both the content of the stories and the act of telling them help to constitute the self. So narrating the desires and relationships people seek in the worlds they inhabit and asserting the selves, desires, and relationships towards which they strive. Theories of desire animate this understanding of stories about LGBTQ sexuality and gender. Stories are inflected with deeply felt yearnings for pleasure, relationship, and possibility. These yearnings and desires have been central to feminist and queer studies of sexuality and education, at least since Michelle Fine's 1988 publication on the missing discourse of young women's desire in sex education. In a 2006 reconsideration of that article, Fine and McClelland offer a framework of thick desire that insists young people are entitled to, among other things, quote, a broad range of desires for meaningful intellectual, political, and social engagement, and a way to imagine living in the future tense. Thick desire is multifaceted, a product of intimate and social negotiations, constituted through economic, political, erotic, and psychological landscapes. This framework supports efforts to resist risk-oriented approaches to LGBTQ sexuality and gender that assume a unidimensional, fixed position. Read through thick desire, stories of LGBTQ sexuality and gender in school become more than accounts of what happened for LGBTQ students and educators, the risks they encounter, and the resilience they demonstrate. Instead, stories articulate and inspire what we call intimate possibilities, the range of desires, relationships, identities, and pleasures one anticipates, pursues, and claims for oneself and others. Even as we insist that all people are entitled to fulfilling, safe, and meaningful lives, intimate possibilities are differently apportioned in a society characterized by entrenched social inequalities. At their best, intimate possibilities are expansive, but they are also marked by disappointment, as people realize that some identities, desires, and relationships are beyond their own and others' reach. Beyond bullying stories explore and elaborate these intimate possibilities. The stories are often, I always say this word wrong. You know when you read a word and you're like, I know that word, interrogative, questioning, residing in urgent intellectual, social, political, and erotic questions, and also relational, holding educators and students in networks as they imagine futures for themselves and for others.
Beyond Bullying located itself in the everyday life of U.S. high schools. For study sites, the team sought public comprehensive high schools with racially diverse student populations, a principal willing to endorse the project, and an ongoing commitment to thinking about LGBTQ issues. That commitment was evident in supported LGBTQ teachers, an active GSA or QSA, or a formal curriculum that addressed LGBTQ issues. After approximately 6 months, we identified Central High School in Minneapolis, East High School in New York, and West High School in San Francisco as our school sites. And as those names suggest, they're pseudonyms, as are all the student and teacher names we'll use. We next arranged meetings with the principals who facilitated our contact with school district research offices to ensure IRB approvals. And we're happy to talk about that process in the Q&A if you're interested. We had 6 ethics reviews to get through. Working with a media partner, the Bay Area Video Coalition, we set up an 8x5x8 wooden booth in each school during the 2014-15 school year. Key teachers, staff, and students advised us where on campus to put the booth, helped us figure out how to build it, and then once built, covered it with decorations, notes, and marks. The booth looked different in each school, as the slides suggest, but all schools marked it as gay, with some combination of rainbows, banners, boas, and sparkling lights, apparently the universal sign of queerness, which, okay with me. A table outside the booths featured notices inviting students to pizza parties and organizing sessions, an iPod and music gift cards that we raffled off to student storytellers, resource sheets listing projects devoted to LGBTQ youth, education, and storytelling, and always a bowl of snacks, granola bars in the morning, and mini chocolate bars in the afternoon. We understood all of these things on the table in some ways to be alibis for the students who wanted to approach the table, right? So if they were approaching this big gay thing on campus, maybe it was because they wanted chocolate, or maybe it was because they wanted to enter the raffle, right? There was a way to do this and still not enter the logic of the booth and remain within the logic of the school. We invited students, teachers, and community members to enter the booth and tell stories about LGBTQ sexuality or gender. The pitch to would-be storytellers was open-ended. Stories could be about themselves, their friends, their families, or cultural or political events. Stories did not even need to be true. Before storytellers entered the booth, we handed them a tablet computer to complete a brief demographic survey and give their informed consent or assent to record and share their stories. Inside the booth, the most significant feature was the camera that sat on a tripod and faced storytellers as they entered. A folding chair faced the camera. At East High, where we received permission only to audio record stories, we replaced the camera with a digital recorder and a microphone. A small carpet covered the floor and foam covered the walls. Storytellers might hear murmurings beyond those walls, especially during lunch periods or between classes, but no one outside the booth could hear them. A piece of black fabric hung behind the chair to provide a consistent backdrop for video recordings, as you'll see. And the sound dampening, the lighting, and the close quarters meant that the booth often became warm. And that's an interesting, to think about the experience of being inside the booth, just the temperature, the climate inside that space. After someone entered the booth and sat in the chair, a researcher clipped the microphone to their shirt, much like this, and adjusted the camera angle. Central and West High storytellers wrote their names on a movie slate. Then the researcher left the booth and shut the door. Storytellers held the slate in front of them, called out action, and began telling a story. The audio process at East High was similarly spare. Storytellers entered the booth, sat down, held the microphone, and once the researcher closed the door, said their name and began speaking. The recordings run from a few seconds long to over 30 minutes. The private, warm, and quiet space to think about LGBTQ sexuality and gender without interruption encouraged storytellers to settle in, and many students, staff, and teachers returned to tell additional stories or to offer new versions of an evolving story. When storytellers finished, they unclipped the microphone, knocked on the wall, and waited for a researcher to open the door. We initially hoped to record 50 visits in the booth in each school for a total of 150 recordings. Instead, we recorded 367 visits to the booths by 306 unique storytellers across the 3 schools. Some recordings included several storytellers with multiple and competing stories, and which gave us at the end a total of over 450 stories told. That's really hopeful, I think, right? So that people were willing to go inside and talk. And just to say, the alibis were there, right? There were reasons to go, but no one, even if they went in under the cover of the raffle ticket or the chocolate bar, once they were inside the booth, they told a story, right? So, and some of the stories were goofy, some of the stories were, you know, killing some time in the school day, but there was a story everywhere, right? There was always something to say. Alongside the booth, our methodology included conducting what we're calling a flash ethnography, an immersive, intensive participant observation effort that explored beyond bullying's implications for the schools. Teams of 2 researchers wrote field notes recording student, staff, and teacher interactions with the booth and the project during the 2-week installation. We also interviewed approximately 25 students, teachers, and staff members in each school to learn more about the school climate, conversations underway about LGBTQ sexualities, and beyond bullying's apparent impact on those conversations. So we're going to pause here and show a brief video that provides an overview of the project. It's just about 5 minutes. And this is a very beautiful thing that we did not create. The Bay Area Video Coalition did that, and thanks very much to them.
I just want to let you guys know that I'm truly grateful for having you guys here, seriously, because no one else will basically listen to my story. Every time I want to bring up, like, gay or bisexual or transgender or something, or lesbian, school doesn't do anything. But then you guys, I tell you guys, and you guys are just like, I know how you feel about it.
Action.
Okay. Action. That was cool, but I'm here to tell a story.
Okay, my story is gonna be about my sexuality.
I just want to tell a story about something that happened to me in elementary school.
So I started off with questioning my gender around a little bit over a year ago.
I act like a girl, I walk like a girl, my body shape is more of like a girl.
I'm 27 years old. I don't know what to write for what I consider my sexuality.
I wear girl clothes, girl shirts, sweaters, pants, shoes. Yes, I even wear panties.
My dad, he hates gay. He thinks different colors. If you like wear certain colors like pink, if you're a boy who wears pink, you're gay. Or if you wear purple, you're gay. I don't know what's up with that.
As I was growing up, I got picked on because I had 2 moms instead of a mom and a dad.
But at school, it's been difficult to try and get people to use my name and pronouns since I used my birth name and she and her throughout my freshman year.
Just living inside this world is hard because being in this world, everyone's judging you.
Because, I mean, even in our religion, it says you're not supposed to make fun of them.
Yeah, right.
Regardless, it doesn't matter if they are Muslim or Somali, whatever it is. But they do. And then it's like, even though they are openly gay, it's not your business to judge them, you know?
Right.
like just because someone likes the same sex doesn't mean they're any less of a person, but I feel like I needed to say that specifically because I'm a Christian and I do not believe in gay marriage.
We've had a few teachers who have actually come in to us actually, and they're really proud to see that we're open about being together. Like we hold hands in the hallways, we're hugging, and we're really close with one another.
The two closest people to me are my diary, which is, and then my best friend, which is his boyfriend, and they both gay.
And that's cool. I'm in a committed relationship with my girlfriend. She's like, she's a handful. I can be honest with that.
And eventually, I like went up to her house and there's this other chick there. I'm like, hey, who's that chick? And she's like, oh, that's my girlfriend. I was like, what? Cool.
And I'm like, I'm bisexual. I have a girlfriend. And my mom's like, what? Really? She like literally dropped what she's doing just to give me a hug.
And now I see him today. He's the most beautifulest girl you could ever imagine.
So I guess I'll end there. Thank you. It's been fun.
That's all.
That's all I have to say.
That was my story.
That's my story.
Yeah, that's my story.
That's my story. Thanks for listening.
That's my story. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for everything. I'll be back again today.
This was the last day in San Francisco here.
Yeah, the tiny icons.
Yeah. Okay.
Is it supposed to be blank?
No. It's supposed to have that on the screen.
Which one? Questions of desire.
Oh, is it there? Yeah, okay.
Great. Okay, so now we're going to just sort of shift and talk a little bit about some of the stories that we collected and some of the lessons we learned about LGBTQ sexuality and gender in schools. So the Beyond Bullying participants used our invitation to reflect on what they wanted for themselves, how they understood themselves, and how they interacted with others in the world. The topic, LGBTQ sexuality and gender, seemed to signal to storytellers an openness on the part of the audience. If the project invited them to talk in school about something as risky as LGBTQ sexuality and gender, then perhaps other topics, for example, anti-immigrant sentiment, gender transgressions, conflicts with Christian and Muslim parents, perhaps these topics were also welcome. And if the boundaries of acceptable school conversations expanded through this project, then the category LGBTQ might also similarly morph, becoming more than a placeholder for worries about bullying. The stories reveal that as much as discourses of bullying structure schools' responses to LGBTQ issues, another more complicated set of relational possibilities circulates through schools, holding open spaces for experimentation, confusion, alliances, and disappointment. So our first theme that we're going to talk about is desire. The invitation to talk about LGBTQ sexuality became an invitation to talk about what desire incites, risks and revelations, relationships and possibilities forged and severed. Luna, a Central High student, declined to answer any of the demographic questions on the survey. She left her sexuality, gender, and race blank, perhaps unwilling or unable to claim a social category. Once inside, Luna described the confusion of not knowing what she wanted, even as she yearned for something. I'm unsure about what I go for, whether it's like guys or girls. And it's really hard because, you know, like you're trying to figure out what you are or what you like, but at the same time, you're kind of confused. So it's like you go and be like, oh yeah, I like a guy, but then again, I like a girl too. It's really confusing when like you don't really know exactly what you like. Luna's desires have not settled down into a coherent identity. If we call her bisexual, we risk celebrating a fluidity that Luna herself, on the one hand, considers a strain, and on the other hand, inhabits readily. Across 2 weeks, she told many stories, on her own and with friends, and through these narrative explorations, multiple experiences of sexual identity emerged. Even in the not knowing, there were stories to tell. Consistently, storytellers resisted making a match between their desires and the L, G, B, T, or Q of the familiar acronym. Instead, they threw off normative constellations of sexuality and gender in favor of trying on new intimate possibilities, exploring the queer relation between what you are and what you like. Skylar, a grade 9 Central High student of European descent, when we say what their race or gender is, that we're using their words. He concluded his story about friendships with gay boys with his own question. I've been questioning like my sexuality a bit. Maybe I'm bisexual. He then slipped into silence, at first glancing away from the camera and then looking directly into the lens as if presenting himself to be seen and heard. Like Luna's story, Skylar's question asks his audience to change the punctuation of identity. Rather than assert, I like boys and girls, therefore I am bisexual, Skylar and Luna ask, if I like girls or boys or both, who might I become? In the demographic survey, Skylar described his sexuality as bisexual. The temptation might be to rewrite the question into a declaration, I am bisexual, but a thick theory of desire foregrounds the searching quality of maybe I'm a bisexual. I lost my, maybe I'm a bisexual. And it also suggests Skylar's question is as true as his declarative responses to the survey questions, bisexual and European ancestry. A thick theory of desire also posits Luna's refusal to answer survey questions as a story as compelling as her struggle. So her refusal to answer the survey questions is also a story as compelling as her struggle to assert an identity while retaining the possibility of desire. In the grammar of thick desire, intimate possibilities are interrogative. Sexuality is experienced as a question, but the answers we might variously offer to ourselves and others are, more often than not, defenses against the question itself. Rather than resolving questions, clear assertions of desires and identity can bring trouble. In the 7th grade, Denise, 15 years old, black, white, and Mexican, announced on Facebook that she was bi. She had a girlfriend, and despite fears that others would not accept her, decided that was me and that's what I wanted to be. Responses were quick and polarized. People who were family to me, they were making rude comments all over the place, telling me I didn't know what I was, didn't know what I want, how bad that was, and nasty, and it was just rude, and I cried a lot. And there were people who were my supporters who were like, it's okay, blah, 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 good for you, Denise, I support you. Denise was determined to remain true to her new identity, and supportive responses continued. Nevertheless, opposition online from friends, families, and strangers was intense. She struggled. Was she, quote, too young just to make a decision like that? Should she take pride in being brave enough to tell people? Both and more, it seems. Now 15 and enrolled at Central, Denise seems unready to commit to the bisexual identity she claimed at 12. But she describes being ready to take a stand in the face of others' opposition. She concludes her story with a call for tolerance, exploration, and integrity. I know a lot of bi and gay people, and I'm still kind of bi-curious, but I'm more straight. But that doesn't mean that I don't love everyone, and that, I don't even really know what I am. So, but just be yourself, no matter how long it takes, no matter who judges you, because being you is the best thing you can do. Uncertainty and curiosity became sites of strength for Denise. A declaration of same-sex desire carves out a space to the side of heterosexuality. There, students risk new intimate possibilities for themselves, imagining selves that exceed prescribed norms. Cody, a pansexual African-American sophomore at Central High, attached himself to Beyond Bullying early on. He helped us make presentations in English classes and spent lunch hours keeping us company and telling stories. Fitting the participation in and around hip-hop dance rehearsals, he fit his participation in around his dance rehearsals. In the first of the 4 stories he told, Cody described a question he is asking about his body. And you'll recognize this from the video. Because I even question at this moment if I'm a girl or not. I wear girl clothes, girl shirts, sweaters, pants, shoes. Yes, I even wear panties. I mean, I'm moody like a girl. Sometimes I'll have like a period moment for a girl, like a girl does. I act like a girl, I walk like a girl, my body shape is more of like a girl. This description affirmed some of what Cody's androgynous gender presentation suggested. He wore body-skimming clothing and nail polish, even as he also wore jeans, hoodies, and sneakers like other artistic young men at Central. Similar variation marked the sexual history Cody chronicled. He talked about ex-girlfriends, drama with his current girlfriend, and young men with whom he had had sex. As in other Beyond Bullying stories, wide-ranging desires signaled a sense of sexual possibility, escape from discomfort, freedom to claim a non-normative identity without punishment, and a commitment to remain true to oneself. For Cody, gender and sexual desires that defied categorization signaled promise. I don't want to fit in with everyone, because fitting in is what gets you hurt. I like being me. I like being different from everyone, because I know me, being different, can get me from lower level to higher level, because I know for a fact that I'm going somewhere. For storytellers, wanting more for oneself and others pointed to a world beyond what was currently available and to the disappointments and demands of what was immediately at hand.
Beyond Bullying collected stories in 2014-15 amid national and state conversations in the United States about marriage equality. In all 3 cities, talking about LGBTQ issues in school meant discussing shifting laws and policies on same-sex marriage, and supporting same-sex marriage became shorthand for signaling one's allegiance with LGBTQ people. 2 lesbian teachers in one school used their marriages to come out to students. Other students and teachers talked about LGBTQ weddings they attended, and students in Minneapolis boasted in their stories about going to the state capitol to celebrate the passing of the marriage equality bill. Marriage equality campaigns positioned the nuclear family as a site of civil rights, combating conventional notions of family as a site of exclusion for LGBTQ people. The stories students and teachers told painted a more complicated picture of family altogether. In each school, students struggled to reconcile the sometimes homophobic views of their parents with their own same-sex and queer desires, testing their foothold in their family life. In middle school, Rihanna, a 17-year-old African-American Muslim girl at Central High who identifies as straight, quote, went through a period where I thought I was kind of lesbian. She had crushes on a couple girls and had 2 girlfriends. However, Rihanna now understands that time is just a stage that ended in 7th grade. I didn't know who I was. I still don't know who I am, but I was kind of experimenting to find out who I was, and that was not me. After a quick, quiet laugh, Rihanna considered what compelled her move away from lesbianism. Now that I think back, it was kind of like, it's like totally against my religion too, which is a big problem. Yeah, I would totally be like banished from my family. The threat of ostracism curbs the possibility of lesbian desire for Rihanna. Like, if I still, thought I was a lesbian, it would totally change my life. Like, really, I feel like it would change it in a bad way. Like, my family will kick me out. Because in our religion, if you're, gay or whatever, it's like you're sinning, I guess. It's like they would think I'm, the devil or something. And I feel like most of my friends would feel like that, too, because they're all Muslim, too. Experimenting with being a lesbian allowed Rihanna to distance herself from her family. It also highlighted the importance of family, faith, and friendship to her sense of belonging. For now, LGBTQ desire introduces a fissure too wide for her to tolerate. Lesbians who did not claim LGBTQ...
Students. You said lesbians.
Oh, did I really? Students who did not claim LGBTQ histories also struggled with homophobic ideas voiced and enforced at home. These students had embraced more accepting attitudes toward gays and lesbians that sometimes stood in stark contrast with their parents. Maria, a straight Dominican student at East High School, distinguished herself from her parents through her acceptance of LGBTQ love. My family tells gay jokes, and it makes me feel uncomfortable. I know they probably don't believe that LGBT because of the way they were raised back in their country, but I don't think it's the best way to judge people. I feel like love is love. I wish I could tell my parents that, but they would never understand. Across recordings, we heard about parents who would never understand the possibilities students imagined. Often, parents' homophobic attitudes were cast as old-fashioned and un-American. Young people's embrace of LGBTQ rights set them apart from these anachronistic ideas and signaled their assimilation into white, middle-class, urban American culture. Similarly, Diola, a straight girl in her sophomore year at East High, discussed repressive laws in Nigeria that criminalize homosexual activity. Diola's rejection of those laws separated her from her Nigerian family and marked her as American, an identity affirmed on her demographic survey when she described herself as Black African American. My mom doesn't seem to understand the reason why people become homosexual, and she doesn't believe in it. But I just feel like you're entitled to do whatever you want because it's your body, it's our life, and you're the only one who's living it. While Diola mobilizes this sentiment to mark herself as American, other students from conservative American Christian communities similarly struggle to reconcile their connection to their families with their acceptance to LGBTQ people. Mitch, a straight, mixed-race first-year student at Central High, laments, "I've always been raised in a Republican Christian family, which, I don't like to be influenced by others' ideologies, but you still live in a world where that's kind of the reality that I don't believe. I don't think there's anyone in my family that isn't Christian." In these stories, families are routinely positioned as a source of homophobic ideas to be renounced on the way to accepting progressive ideas about LGBTQ rights. But also buried in these stories of progress and acceptance are compromises born of intimacy. Mitch, for example, ends his story with a plaintive, "But hey, he's my dad. I love him." Children of LGBTQ parents similarly negotiated closeness to and distance from their parents while also contending with others' confused responses to their family structures. Jessa, an Asian Native American first-year student from Central High, described her family. Her mom had Jessa and her brother while a teenager. After her father left, her mom started dating girls. Jessa grew up thinking her home life was normal, and then peers began to challenge that idea. I would get teased all the time, and how people would say that my mom would touch me inappropriately because she's a lesbian. But my mom would never has done that. And I just got teased a lot about it because my mom is a lesbian. I just got teased saying stuff like that, or how my mom's just weird, and how I'm probably because I'm weird because I was raised by her and everything. The idea of family intimacy takes a homophobic turn as Jessa describes the danger of being contaminated by her mom's queerness. Her current family configuration continues to define norms. Her mom is now married to her stepmom, and they had a son and a daughter, Jessa's half-siblings, through artificial insemination. The connections between the 4 children confuses people. When I say I have 2 moms, everybody's like, "You have 2 moms?" Okay, but they don't understand that I'm saying that they're together. They always think that it's my dad is with somebody. So they always get confused about that. I actually have a dad. They just always want to know how I was born. And then I tell them, "Oh, I have a dad." And they're like, "Oh." And then my brother and sister don't have a dad. They just have our 2 moms. So, and they've just always been like that. Jessa's story confirms that families not only exist in a world of routinely constrained intimate possibilities, but also help to render possibilities, alternately affirming and contesting conventional ideas about what constitutes legitimate connection. Schools, like families, prove to be important grounds for storytellers. Stories regularly depict school as a simultaneously site of safety and danger, a space that incites and regulates students' sexualities, and an arena in which teachers face political and personal challenges. In this presentation, we're focusing on the students, but we have stories from teachers, and if you're interested, we can talk about those in the Q&A as well. Students narrated experiences of hardship, often arising from the collective behavior of students enforcing ideas about acceptable gender, sexual, and racial identities. Sexuality intersected with other categories of difference, making it difficult to identify a single site of discrimination. Josue, a 19-year-old senior originally born in Central America, described the experience of being consistently misrecognized when he arrived in the United States and began attending classes at the small school for non-native English speakers housed inside Central High School. People call me Indian, but I'm not from India, and no one knows that. Really, I'm gay. Eventually, Josue came out to people at school, and his peers, quote, started talking about me behind me and saying, I am the stupid boy. Name-calling escalated into pushing, and Josue decided to confide in his teachers. With their support, Josue learned to just let everything go, just be myself, just start doing leadership things, just start helping my new classmates, helping the new people who come to the country, doesn't speak English, helping them, trying to help in math class with kids, trying to teach every single kid where the bathroom is in the school, where they can go if they need help. I start feeling more stronger, like never in my life. Leadership opportunities, formal and informal, helped Josue fashion a new sense of self, strong and self-sufficient, a resource for other immigrant students. He also rethought school as a site of learning and a physical space that immigrant students could navigate with ease. As adept as a navigator as Josue was, his gayness makes his leadership status among his peers tenuous. He draws on a sense of inner strength to remain resolute despite continuing harassment. Some students that I know are kind of against me because I am gay. They think that I can do nothing for anyone at school, but they were wrong because I can do more than them. I am more strong than what they think. Before, their words were killing me, but now their words are making me strong. Ultimately, Josue describes his story as about leadership because people think that gay people cannot lead a community. That's mean. You can do anything. But Josue's story suggests that opposition is not merely an obstacle to leadership, it's also leadership's impetus. Rather than dissuade Josue, his peers' hostility fuels him. A familiar narrative of triumph emerges. So too does a story of school communities led by gay immigrant students. While stories of school and schooling often include some description of resistance to LGBTQ sexuality and gender, not all stories have as triumphant a tone as Josue's. Eli, a first-year student at Central High School, begins their story, and you'll recognize this as well. I started off with questioning my gender around a little bit over a year ago. And then I started just switching my name and then my pronouns, and here we are. I use ze and zer and they and their, and I fluctuate in my presentation, like I'm wearing a binder today. But I like to put on makeup too. I like to wear dresses, so my presentation is definitely in flux. School has presented a particular challenge for Eli. They asked teachers and students to use their chosen name and pronouns, and one teacher, someone Eli had admired and trusted, found the request confusing. The teacher asked Eli, "You want to be referred to as multiple people?" He was very confused, and sometimes he does well with it, but other times, like even though it's been months and months since I told him about this, he still uses femininely coded, gendered words to refer to me. And that kind of hurts because I very much felt like, oh, this is a teacher I really like, that I feel like I can trust, and that I can tell him about what I want, like to be called in the classroom because I feel like I'm more respected. And I'm giving him respect by letting him know. For Eli, this teacher's failure to embrace their chosen pronouns, name, and gender identity is more disappointing than the challenge more frequently recognized in the popular news media in the States, in North America, that of having access to appropriately gendered bathrooms or locker rooms. Eli even says, I would prefer to have some gender neutral space to be able to change and use the bathroom, but I can deal with it. But knowing that all these people will look at me as though I'm a girl, and even though I'm not, and that they'll always see me as a girl, that really hurts too. Eli trails off, laughing quietly, and closes the story. Eli struggles with misrecognition much as Josue did. Josue struggled with his peers believing him to be Indian, not Ecuadorian, and gay, and therefore weak. Eli is pained to know that their peers and respected teachers continue to consider them a girl and believe their call for gender-neutral pronouns constitutes a joke, a grammatical error, or a request easily dismissed. Josue is able to rewrite his story as one of strength. Even their opposition fuels him. But Eli continues to struggle despite a willingness to compromise and a deep sense of respect and empathy, even for those adults who disappoint them, right? The empathy for the teacher in that story is pretty striking. Both students, through their stories of struggle, point to another set of possibility in which gay immigrant students lead and trusted teachers affirm shifting gender identities and prove themselves deserving of students' trust. Consistently, student stories suggest that queerness circulates in school not only as a site of struggle, but also as a set of intimate possibilities. Josue and Eli call their classmates and teachers into a supportive stance in relationship to gayness and gender fluidity. Their classmates and teachers respond to those calls by standing in solidarity, quietly distancing themselves from the claims, or refusing to recognize the queerness. Patrick hears, I'm skipping that. The difference among these speakers are many. They come from different racial and gender and sexual categories, have different histories as transplants to their cities and schools. And among the things they share, though, is the task of claiming their relationship to LGBTQ sexuality and gender.
In each school Beyond Bullying visited, as the team set up the booth and coordinated presentations in classes, we felt vulnerable. How would schools respond to invitations to step inside the booth and share stories about sexuality and gender? What would people say once they were alone, sitting in front of the camera or holding onto the microphone? Would students use this opportunity to air homophobic ideas? Would teachers resent our presence? What narratives of gender and sexuality would the booth call forth? Our apprehension reflected the challenge of discussing LGBTQ sexuality and gender in schools. The team recognized that discourses of bullying might provide cover for nervous educators or researchers, and yet we remained convinced that discourses of bullying stunt the intimate possibilities available to students and teachers. Beyond Bullying's task was to insist that LGBTQ sexuality and gender have a place in schooling, but not to set the terms of queerness residing there. We prompted storytelling, but we did not insist on the story's content, arc, or length. Neither guided nor interrupted, storytellers mapped possibilities, charted new relations, and claimed shaky identities. In other words, they did the work of thick desire, and as Fannie McClellan described, imagined life in the future tense. LGBTQ sexuality and gender provided a staging ground for this imagining of intimate intellectual, political, social, and erotic possibilities. In the delicate space between the content of the stories and the act of telling them, students and educators illustrated the importance of stories and storytelling to understanding, exploring, and inhabiting sexual and gendered lives. Their stories also point to the importance of not anticipating an end to the stories people tell about their sexualities and gender. Through their stories, students and teachers at Central East and West High schools imagined worlds in which they claimed identities or no identity at all, in which a bold statement about one's sexual or gender identity in one moment might become a question in another. And this committed interrogative stance resonates with educational practice that insists on teaching and learning as world-making, that notice and contest the conditions limiting the possible worlds, and that refuses to deny either students or teachers the room to imagine otherwise for themselves and others. This, we think, is the education that lies beyond bullying, beyond the classroom, and beyond intervention. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, questions that people have? Who'd like to begin? Is there anybody that would like to make a start?
We're happy to talk about how we designed the project, the challenges of doing something like this, more about the stories, more about teachers. I mean, really, you can ask anything.
Charles.
Thanks, Kathleen. I'm just wondering, because I really appreciated what you've, what you've presented, and one of the thoughts I had was you focused on the telling of the stories. What about the hearing of the stories and listening to the stories and the impact that has in terms of, possibilities of imagining otherness.
Like ourselves as researchers.
Yourselves as researchers, but even drawing beyond that, you know, what it is to hear people telling these stories in terms of what that does for the person hearing. Yeah.
Do you want to start? Well, I think that there are a couple places I'd go. One, there's the impact of knowing that there are stories to be heard, even without having heard the stories. So the fact that there was this booth and there was this constant flow of storytellers signaled to the school, even those who weren't participating in the project, that there was a story to be heard, that they had not yet heard, perhaps. That in itself feels like something we tried to pick up in the ethnographic work, right? What does it mean to witness simply that there are stories in this space? We don't, I don't think you're asking about this, but just to be clear, we don't have a sort of pre-post test of the impact of having heard a story. We're not especially interested in that, right? If one hears this, does your level of acceptance go up or down or something like that? That's not, I don't think that's what you're asking for, but that's, and we're not especially interested in that either. We do, though, have data on what it was like to animate stories that were not your own. So we had at Central High, one of the after-school events was a pizza party, always pizza party, where we brought stories from West High and distributed them to those students who showed up arbitrarily. So you would get 1 or 2 sheets of paper of a transcribed story edited for readability, lightly edited, and then the students would read the story out loud in the group. And so they read, I am blank, right? And it was not usually someone who aligned with themselves. And they took the stories very seriously. You know, they thought about what it was like to have told that story, both for that person to have told the story, but also for themselves to inhabit that experience. And that feels, I don't know, I mean, I'm a sociologist, so I'm reluctant to say the impact was this, because I don't really know, but in watching it, the feel in the room was that there's something quite generative about sitting in someone else's experience, right? And to talk about the risk it would require to tell that story, which then requires you to think about what it's like for you to be the audience of that story, right? So if you have to understand that it would be painful to tell the story of your grandmother kicking you out, you then have to think about how you would listen to the story of someone telling you that their grandmother kicked you out, right? So I think that's, in terms of what this could mean in classrooms, what this could mean for educators, I think that's an enormous resource, right? And it's not, because it's not only empathizing, it's really inhabiting, right? And pulling it into yourself. Yeah.
Thank you
for the question.
Thank you.
Could you pass that? Vanessa, could you pass that? Huh? Sorry.
I think Adi had a question too earlier. Yeah.
That makes me think about, like in the controversy around safe schools in Australia, one of the biggest concerns people had was an exercise that was about empathy, and that you had to imagine like what it was like to be gay for a day sort of thing, which I have problems with as an exercise. And I think that what you're talking about here is much more powerful, because that sense of it's like because of the way that the stories are generated, and what the possibilities might be in thinking about. Like, it reminds me a little bit of that. I can't remember the name of it because I'm not a creative person, but it's that style of speaking where you're inhabiting somebody else's speech and you actually mimic them as well while you're doing the, I don't know, there's a name for it. As a Sorry?
No, I see it. It felt that when you were describing it, it felt like psychodrama.
That's not it. No.
I know, but
yeah, but I think that's interesting in terms of like what are the different modalities and how that's quite a radical shift, and I think very productive in what the pedagogical possibilities are beyond the project.
I think that there's a, I can't comment on the safe schools, I don't know the exercise, but I think one of the pieces that's especially productive here is that being gay also means being from Ecuador and being misrecognized as being Indian, right? So it's not, so it's not that being gay is only about being gay, it's about being immigrant, it's about being misrecognized, it's about being a leader, and also the stories included people saying, I'm really, really uncomfortable around gay people, right? So it wasn't a a place that we were expecting them to either throw off the feeling or take on a feeling. Right? We wanted, part of what we were trying to do is get teachers, students, and staff to talk about how they experienced LGBTQ sexuality, and the assumption was that we cannot anticipate all of what that might mean for someone, and that all of those stories are welcome in this booth because we're trying to understand the stories being told at the school. And that means that the story of the that you saw in the video of the boy who says, you know, I recognize someone who likes someone of the opposite sex as human, and I do not support same-sex marriage. And he holds both of those ideas. And so that's possible, right? So and we need to understand that, recognize that, as that opposing same-sex marriage, even if we object or disagree, that does not mean he's unwilling to see me as human. So that's more complicated, right? I have to figure that out.
I felt a lot of emotion in the room when you were talking and showing the video clips especially. I'm interested in how your response to the kind of the telling of the story and then what happens next, and the kind of that the booth is like almost a singular storytelling experience, and the students were obviously thankful for the opportunity and the chance to tell their story. What did they understand then was going to happen to their story? Mm-hmm. Who was going to receive it? And were students then demanding a chance to tell that in a more public way? Some students, was there kind of, who was listening, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, there's a couple, I'll have a rambling answer if that's okay, because it's complicated and each site was different, and it speaks to the ways in which we got permission both from our universities and school boards to mount the project. So we had initially thought, this is sort of, so the backstory is, we initially thought that parental consent would be an impediment to the project's success. And so we argued successfully with our 3 universities and with the first school board that students shouldn't have to get parental consent to participate, because having the conversation with their parents was riskier than their participation. And the San Francisco Unified School District and our 3 universities agreed after make sure there's lots of resource pages on at the booth, there's lots of sort of scaffolding around the project. It meant that it was very easy in San Francisco for someone to participate. It didn't require the endorsement of the school in the same way, really. We were there sort of more independently. Whereas, for instance, in Minneapolis and New York, they did require parental consent to participate. And in Minneapolis, and I think this was the case in New York, if there's a research project, the school itself must mail out in 5 languages the consent form to each family. And so and in a way, for the school to say we endorse the project. And we had thought, oh, this is bad news. We'd had we did San Francisco first, it was really great. Actually, it turned out not to be the case. Most of the storytellers you see are from Minneapolis, in part because when we sent out consent forms to parents, the consent form to participate and the media release were on the same page. And we realized that, I think we were talking about this with someone, that the economy of school consent forms goes like, Mom, would you sign this? And they're like, what's it for? Oh, just a storytelling project, sign here and here. And they're like, all right. And we had extra consent forms at the table, and they disappeared during the day and then returned. And so we were always getting new consenters, assenters for the students. And it meant that we just were able to initially, at sort of the first glance, have a lot of parental media releases. Now, we did go back for this video because we knew we wanted to be able to circulate it widely and not just show it at conferences and put it up on the website. We went back to everyone who speaks in the video, told them what we had put in the video, and said, okay, just checking. how do you feel about, and this is the ways in which that video might circulate, here's how we think it'll be used. And everyone on the video said, yeah, that's fine. And some of them were like, yeah, like they're sort of in a culture where exposure on the web and is, really a sign of status. So, so that's one of the ways we went back and talked to young people about how we were going to use their images, how we were going to use their words, and so on. We feel like we've used all of their descriptors, as you notice, through how they describe themselves, which sometimes is a little awkward. We don't normally describe white boys as of European descent. But if we say that we're going to commit to Cody and call him pansexual, then we have to respect everybody's choices about how they want to be identified. So that's a sort of meandering answer to say that that for the video and for their faces and their words, that was sort of the feedback loop. What was the second part of the question?
There's also a question about who's listening. And are you asking more sort of we think they imagined was listening, as well as the more sort of practical questions? Yeah.
Like there might be a kid who went into the booth not knowing what they were going to say, or even
many.
They came out thinking, "That is my story. Now, how am I going to share that with other people? Or are you going to share it? Or does my school?" They might have wanted it to go further than just the camera and the research project.
Right.
Was that ever the case? I guess.
Well, we did interviews in each school, and we tried to interview, in particular, people who'd been inside the booth. So not only people who'd been in the booth, sort of key players in the school also were interviewed. And people didn't, I think that for most of I don't know if we asked that question in particular, that's why I'm sort of reaching for an answer. I think that some of them found the possibility of an audience quite thrilling. Like Cody was really into it. Cody wanted people to see it. When I went back and said, so here's what we're showing the panties part, right? Like because we just wanted to make sure, right? I mean, some people are just going to have it's possible that someone will have an ill thought about Cody. And I'm going to protect Cody, but I want him to also feel like he's up for it, right? He's like, yeah, right? I mean, this is part of Cody's experience of the world, as Jen's saying. And I think it's partly cultural. It's also Cody wanting wanting more for himself, a sense of being having that larger audience is also about reaching beyond where he is. I think it's possible that that the schools felt shifted by the stories having been told in the booth, that later there was a sense that these stories will be told. At Central High, where the school took up the project more than any of the other schools, their GSA was really invigorated by our having been there. When we went back to a GSA meeting, there were people that we recognized having been in the booth who hadn't been in the GSA the year before. I don't know that, I guess I'm reluctant to say this is what made it happen, but I think there's a relationship. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome presentation. I'm just thinking, when the video started, someone I think shared that they don't normally have their stories heard, and I'm just and like the young people like Cody, for example, who got really attached to your project. Yeah, does your project continue afterwards in terms of support? Because some of the young people are, when you're isolated in a school or in a society, and coming out and all that, what support was provided?
None. That's not quite true. I mean, I think that one of the things that was very interesting about the booth that we sort of alluded to in the paper is that, there are and you all know from working in schools that there's all these kids, and they may tend to be queer or genderqueer, but it's not only queer and genderqueer kids. It's just like around the margins of the school, and the booth kind of was a little bit of a home. So we had a lot of not a lot, but a number of kids from like the special ed who would hang out with us at lunch, you know, lots of kids who were academically sort of like having a difficult time, that the booth was sort of like a school-sanctioned space that wasn't class. You know, we always had, I don't know if it's the same process here, but we always had hall passes, you know, so it was a place you could go and not be in class, but not be out of class either. And I think that for those 2 weeks, the booth was really powerful. So, for instance, there was, you saw the 2 Muslim girls telling the story in the middle. There was this small group of sort of like progressive Muslim girls. It was in Central, there's a very large Oromo American and Somali American community in Minneapolis. And the school had historically sort of been home to that community. And so there was still a lot of students in the booth. For instance, we had to clear out every day, midday, so the students could go in and pray. Which is kind of, we have written about that. It's kind of awesome, right? The big gay booth also being the prayer space for the Muslim students and us hanging out together. So, you know, they also sort of found a place to hang out at the booth and talk about what it was like to be them and to be kind of in these competing contexts, school. Oh, I know what I was going to say. It's like one of the girls who came into the booth wanted to go to university but was really nervous about going to the University of Minnesota because there wasn't a lot of girls or young women there who wear the niqab. And I'm from Toronto, and my university does have like a lot of Somali Canadians, but also women who wear various niqab hijabs. So she was like, I was like hooking her up with the international student admissions place. And so lots of that kind of thing, informal, happened over the course of the 2 weeks. And we really did have a sense in these particular schools that being non-teachers and university resources, that we had researchers, that we had resources to offer them. And all of our, not all, but many of our RAs who were with us, because it's a lot to staff this thing, were young university students. And also really connected with students and offered sort of like an idea of an afterword, a future tense. But in terms of follow-up, like what happens to Cody when we leave, you know, we went back to Central a couple times and talked to him, and he was very excited to see us, and we have a Facebook page and he follows us. And but we were really clear, and we've written about this too, that we didn't want to turn the booth into a function of the school in order to educate. You know, we thought that the power of the booth was actually that it wasn't supposed to do, it wasn't supposed to become an intervention. We didn't want it to have some pedagogical aim so that we could say at the end, look, and therefore you should do X, Y, and Z to make your school a safer place. We wanted to imagine, like, what would it be to sort of step outside of that logic. But I'll just say one last thing, which is Jessica led a paper about Central High, the Minneapolis school, and the ways in which the project, what's the word? It didn't cause it, but there is a relation. Like the year after we left, the school had applied for a very big grant to renovate their auditorium, which was totally dilapidated and where our booth was set up. So the space where the booth was, the next year all of a sudden was having a major makeover, and there was like this infusion of money for the arts, and there was just a sense of that the project in Central in particular was tied to sort of neoliberal ideas about improving school achievement. You know, that a good school is one that welcomes LGBTQ students. And our project sort of demonstrated to the wider community, look, our school's not backwards, not stuck in these old prejudices, forward thinking. We have a gay storytelling booth. So we were sort of taken up that way by the schools as well. How did I do?
You did great.
Okay.
I think there's also like this. There's a sense, right, especially because you see their faces and you hear their stories, and of wanting to have this long-term connection with them. right? They feel very much like people, and what happens to Cody, and right? And we did all of this work to allow that to happen, right? To have these return visits, the social media, like all these places of contact, helping them, individual students in particular ways. And I don't know that they wanted it, right? Like, I think that it requires a lot of our participants to maintain relationships with middle-aged, white, lesbian faculty members. Like, how, you know what I mean? Like, we're really very interesting when we put a camera on them and are, right? But like, to have a long-term relationship with me, I don't know that Cody really wants a long-term relationship with me, right? And I would, if Cody needed something from me, I'm there, right? And Cody knows where to find me, and all of them do, but I think there's something about me not needing that from him. And I don't know that that's right, but there's something about letting go of that good answer to your question. Do you know, right? Because I would love to be able to say, yeah, every year there's a Welcome Back Beyond Bullying party, and we go, and everybody shows up, and now they're, 30 years old and safely housed and having families of their own. Do you know what I mean? Right? I don't know. But I don't think they don't owe me that in a way, right? They don't owe me that story just by having told this story. Even though I wish for it, right? I wish for it.
I was wondering, because I love the way that these stories are so unhinged. Like, they're not tied into anything, and the kids aren't pushed into one narrative or another. But I did wonder how this plays with and ties into sort of coming out narratives and the necessity to tell your story in order to qualify as part of the LGBTQ community, and how it played into sort of narratives around homonationalism, and like, because lots of the students were, it was part of their being American and part of their not being an immigrant.
I don't, the students who used their acceptance of LGBTQ life, love, friends were mostly straight, to name themselves as American. So they were, we were in the 3 schools, I don't know if it was the majority, but a large number of students were first-generation American and had immigrant parents, either from Central America, from Asia, from Somalia. I mean, so we were working with a lot of, all 3 schools, the majority of students were students of color. And so they're already, their claim to Americanness is a little tenuous because of their race, but also because of their relationship to immigration. And so the straight students, daughters and sons of immigrants, used their acceptance of LGBTQ sexuality and gender as a sign of their progressiveness, and in contrast to their parents who were backward, Catholic, religious, etc. And that's something we've thought about in terms of the queer and genderqueer students. I don't think that was quite as much. That wasn't really as much a theme, and so the idea of homonationalism there doesn't quite. I don't quite see it yet. In part because even as they're using the tropes of the coming out narrative, they're not on like a path. Like, we heard so many stories of young women saying, well, I thought, like we shared, well, I thought I was a lesbian in grade 6, which is like 11 years old, and then I changed my mind, and now one story, someone talks about, yeah, I'm leaning toward the ladies. So they, if there was a coming out narrative, we were meeting it as researchers right in the middle, before they had solidified the story of themselves into an account of how they came to be X, Y, or Z. And that was kind of exciting. And one of the challenges for us, and I talked about this a bit yesterday in the workshop, one of the challenges for us as adult researchers was not to write the end of their story for them, to not decide that they were on their way to being a lesbian or being gay or being trans in particular ways. We had to sort of, stop ourselves from deciding we knew who they were or who they would become, because the stories really did shift. And because people told multiple stories, they also shifted like within the space of 2 weeks, not just,
Mm-hmm. And I think it's that the stories, it's not that the stories were unhinged. I think it's rather that the storytelling was, we tried to be very careful about what the hinges were, right? So, so we had the interviewing, the ethnographic, and then the storytelling, so that we could look at it from all these different angles. We assume the stories are hinged. The question is, where are they hinged? What are the hinges? What do those hinges do to constrain or facilitate possibility, right? So what does it mean when one of your tasks is figuring out who you are as a sexual being and separating from your parents and figuring out who you are as a person of color living in a racist United States? Okay, so you have got all of that. So how do you find a hinge? Because you're gonna need a hinge, right? Because that's a lot for anybody to take on, especially someone with limited resources, whatever those resources might be. So we wanted to know, what does it mean? Does the booth become a hinge? Do we become a hinge? How do we become a hinge for them? Rather than deciding this will be the hinge, right? Because as a qualitative researcher, usually the hinges I provide are probing questions, an interview guide, right? So these habits as a researcher of what the hinges will be. And we tried to say, okay, you can go inside this booth and you can stay as long as you want. No one's gonna tell you to leave. And as soon as you're ready to come, you get to leave. We're just gonna stand right outside here, and as soon as you knock, you get to come out. And we're not even gonna come back to you and ask you to clarify the story. The story just stands. And that's really hard, because there are stories where you think, I wish I could ask, right? I wish I knew. Is she talking about him? Right? Because stories start to overlap, right? But we're not gonna do it. We can't start drawing the lines because they didn't draw the lines, right? Or we can't say, oh, she'll be by in a year, right? We're just not gonna do it. Today she is, tomorrow who knows, she was. All of it is as true as the ones before. And that means that then the hinges become more evident, right? As opposed to us knowing in advance.
Mm. Yeah. Deb?
So thank you for that, and I agree it was an incredibly empathetic film, it was very moving. My question actually is around the young man who you had talked about before, and I can't remember his name, who said, look, I'm not in favour of gay marriage. And just thinking about, what enticed him into the booth, I suppose, and that was quite a big step, isn't it, to step into the rainbow-coloured all lights booth, and whether there were more. I mean, how many participants you had who actually were, not quite there, but maybe never there, obviously coming from lots of different family backgrounds, and then again they're going to be on film, and what that would mean for them, and we won't know. And but I'm just interested in, again, whether there were any threats as well. I mean, whether I can imagine in Australia, possibly in some schools, you would actually have people deciding to storm the place and actually be very negative about it, and it being potentially a bit of an unsafe place, and whether you had any experiences around that.
You should talk about that.
Okay. Well, I'll talk about it because what's his name?
Jared.
I thought it said his name. It's Jared. Oh, Jared is the young man in the film. I'll just start with the last part to say that, teachers were very, very worried that students were going to come and write faggot all over the booth in the middle of the night, and we'd arrive and nothing like that happened. They were worried they were going to steal the camera. Didn't happen. No, we had no experiences of vandalism. People didn't, I'm sure there are people who are opposed to the project in the schools, but they did this, here was the booth and they walked like this around it, and they appear as characters and figures in other people's stories, but didn't necessarily tell stories themselves. In New York City, where we had audio only, we did hear more stories that you might call homophobic, though we didn't think any of them were terrible. And they mostly began something like, I don't think gays are natural or something. And then they'll keep talking because it's, you know, they're rambling because they're holding a mic, and then be like, well, but I have a cousin, and, you know, he's all right, and I don't think it's great that my dad treats him so badly. And, but yeah, gays, I don't know. You know, so it's like, it's very complicated, the relationships people have to this topic. And there's, I mean, we'd be hard pressed to find a young person who didn't have a relationship with a gay person. And that modifies their feelings about real people, you know. And Jared's a really good example, because Jared was attached to the booth from the beginning. Every day he was there, he hung out, not all his friends, but he hung out with all the queer kids, and they all knew about his feelings about same-sex marriage, and they would argue with him, and every day we'd say, Jared, can you please bring in your parental consent so you can tell a story? He's like, yeah, I will, I forget. And then it kind of comes out that his dad has had a very bad car accident and is at home and quite incapacitated, and he doesn't want to bother him. And then it comes out that actually that his dad, because this was in the midst of marriage equality debates in the state of Minnesota, was very opposed to same-sex marriage. And so, you know, and Jared's his son, and his dad is very, very ill. So to ask Jared to sort of abandon this belief that was so important to his father and come on board with same-sex marriage while his dad is lying ill just seems like too much to ask, especially since Jared in all other ways is like the perfect ally. You know, he's hanging out, his friends are gay, he's like, you know, he did presentations with us in class to encourage people to come to the booth. And when we went back a couple years later, there was Jared again, still hanging out with the queer kids. So I think that the danger is, as educators, we think we need to cure young people's homophobia, but without understanding that homophobia functions differently for different people. And in this case, for Jared, homophobia is actually a kind of love for his dad. You know, how screwed up is that, right? So, and I think that was the case in the New York stories too, where just as we're saying that adoption of progressive ideas about LGBTQ sexuality signals young people's kind of embrace of American values and a distance from their family, so too does homophobia, the casual homophobia, hold them close to their parents. And so to insist that they have to give up their parents in order to be good people, I mean, that's really a hard thing to do. So I think we have to see homophobia almost as a symptom as opposed to just a cause. Abdi has been asking for a question since the beginning. Yeah.
Sorry. I'm just wondering, with the amount of stories you got, which was about 3 times as much as you expected, and listening to some of the stories in the videos, there was so much need for those kids to speak out and tell their stories. Did any of those videos raise any red flags to you that said, this person needs help, this person's in trouble, and how did you handle that when that happened?
Yeah, so our practice was to review at the end of every school day the card that we had collected stories on for that day. So that was part of our ethics process. We had to make sure that there wasn't someone who was in need of intervention. And we would just sort of move through pretty quickly, listen, and we only had one story actually where the person told a story where they felt like they might be thinking about harming themselves. They just felt sort of self-destructive in the story. There were lots of stories of sadness, lots of stories of struggle, but it felt like the person is sad and struggling and is moving, right? It's sort of in it, right? And so for that one, it was actually at West. We went to Evan, the person who was the sort of LGBTQ leader on campus, and said, this guy was in the booth, you know, and we just wanted to let you know that, and he's like, yeah, we know. Not in a dismissive way, but we know. And so you had a sense that the school, we're not going in and finding something that the school doesn't already know about. They spent a lot of time with these kids, these teachers are aware, and he was part of that capture. I think what we left thinking more is that what we want is for teachers to learn how to listen to young people differently. Like to hear this, like when you hear the story about I don't want to support same-sex marriage, like could we listen for the investment that makes that position important to that student, instead of deciding we need to help that student get over it, to get past that, right? Instead, could we just listen and assume that young people are as complicated and conflicted and dynamic as adults, and we hold contradictory ideas in the same moment, and how can we support young people in that process? Because Jared's struggle continues, not because of the booth, but because he has these friendship circles and a family life that are hard to reconcile. And that's very familiar to me, right? Like that's a thing that many of us contend with, right? Our lives don't all knit. So how then can we help him with that and not require him to see his education as at odds with his family life? Because that also feels familiar to me. Right? That's a pain, a familiar pain. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right, yeah, I get nervous the minute this microphone's on my hands. Yeah, first of all, thank you very much. I really loved listening to that. I guess one question I have is that the power of these stories, I think, lies in their particularity, their ambiguity, and their complexity. I'm just wondering, as researchers, what do you see your role? Like, what can you add to those stories that is of value, that doesn't impose generalizations or categorizations?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's very hard to work with 450 stories, right? And to know them all, and we do, you can see we have our favorites, you know, that we feel sort of exemplify sort of what we were thinking about in the project. But I think our role as researchers in this case is to kind of be able to step back from the particularities of each story. Well, I think we have multiple positions, to be honest. Like with Jared's story, for instance, that is a story I've worked with a lot. And it's really important to me, his particular story. But there is also, we are also trying to make some claims about the stories in general. So for instance, I think one of our lessons that we talked about here is that when you ask people to talk about something as risky as queer, gender, and sexualities, you make the school open to other kinds of stories. You signal that this school can handle it. And so so we heard a lot of stories that didn't have anything to do with gender and sexuality on the surface, but had to do with immigration, a lot of stories about death, a lot of stories about the pain of moving home mid-term, you know, like things that really matter to young people. So I think that as researchers, you know, there's on the one hand, we want to honor the specificity of particular stories that we're working with, and not, you know, use chunks of data, kind of allow people access to this particular person, but we also want to be able to make some claims about the kinds of stories that circulate in school that don't cue to this very, very specific idea of bullying, that there's more stories at stake in circulation in schools about lesbian and gay sexuality, about trans and gender queer kids than the schools currently can pay attention to. And that's really important to know. You know, it's, for instance, I think schools have, for instance, this idea that our job as educators and as schools is to educate young people out of homophobia, out of transphobia, to make them better people. And one of the things we learned was that actually most of our storytellers already had much more complicated ideas about gender and sexuality than their teachers did, than we gave them credit for. And most of them had meaningful friendships and family relationships with LGBTQ people. You know, so it's not like an abstract idea. This is like, how do I be a good granddaughter to my grandmother who's a lesbian? And I think that you can only do that when you have 450 stories and you're able to stand above and say, okay, here's the themes that are emerging from all of these. But then you're right. I mean, when you see their faces and you listen to them talk, and on our website you can hear their voices, it's very, very powerful, because if you're talking about LGBT, sexuality, and gender, you're talking about the things that are most important to us in life: love, relationships, desire, family, acceptance, belonging, you know, and they definitely are telling those stories. You want to add anything?
I think it was just, you know, in sociology, the task is to generalize, right? That's the point of the disciplines, that's the aim. But I've never really been interested in generalizing across categories of people, and more interested in generalizing about social processes or institutions. So I think that's where, like, I want to think about intimate possibilities. I want to generalize about that. So across all these stories, even though it looks and sounds quite different for the individual people, there is this generalizable experience of seeking possibilities around who you and others might be. And that those possibilities across those experiences bump up against disappointment and constraints. Like, that's the generalized experience, as opposed to this category of people is more likely to meet this obstacle along the way. But I think then to think about the school, like, we can make generalizations about institutions and what does it feel like to be in that institution, or try to find a self within that institution. And those generalizations feel really valuable to me, because we as people occupy and animate those institutions, right? There are possibilities for interruption, there are ways that we might listen differently to the possibilities, but there's a place for the person or the individual within that generalization, whereas when I hear the generalizations about categories of people, I start feeling lost in it myself, right? Like, where I want to argue back with my particularities, as opposed to hearing like, oh yeah, there is a sense that I might have something or might be something, and then I also have the sense that I could never be that. Right, and that's also the idea of an intimate possibility always calls up the idea of an impossibility. That's right. We can't have one without the other.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful thing in the world. Really, it's just so exciting and mind-blowing. I'm just kind of mind-blown, to be honest, so I'm still sort of absorbing everything. And some of the things that I'm sort of wondering about sort of touch on a few of these points, really, around the very act of storytelling and how that produces, in some ways, a subjectivity that wasn't always sort of available before. The act of being asked to share your thoughts, or being given that opportunity to have someone who will listen to you. And I'm just so struck by, in my own experience with young people talking around these topics, how that very act then also seems to shift some of their future trajectories in ways that are unanticipated for the actors involved in that situation. Mm-hmm. And I was just curious if you had any thoughts on that, or what your fantasies were, I guess. And I think in some ways you've sort of touched on that too. Because I loved your methodology, having that black curtain behind, and this talks to that particularity bit. Like, as a visual person, I love that one of the people had that fabulous pink kind of indigo hat on.
I know, you want to dress them before they go in.
Yeah,
it's gonna look good. Put this hat on.
That would be cool if you could even have like a little, like, here's the the clothes horse outside, and you could dress up, and that ability to both sort of celebrate people's sort of individuality, and to also really emphasize that point that actually we are all different, and that we're not all kind of the single unitary kind of thing. And I found that really compelling, quite exciting to see that. And I also loved that by having a space that people could come back to, that they could re-story, complicate, contradict their narratives in ways that I imagine were quite wonderful, and also complicating for you as, you know, to research it and kind of explore that through. But also so powerful because by creating that total anonymous space with the sense, because I was thinking, could you get community people to come in? You know, I'm a community psychologist, so could you get, you know, community actors to come in to schools and be like, we want to support you to talk about these stories. But I wonder about your power as researchers, if that shifts the stories that are told in ways, you know, that would be different if say, you know, someone from the community was here and we want to hear what your experiences are like. I guess I'm just so disorganized in my thinking, but I just want to put some of those ideas out there and see if they bounce anything off you, because I think it was great.
I love the idea of the dress-up box outside the booth. Actually, that's interesting. I think I'll just comment on the last part about what we might have provoked, because I was quite aware of what it meant to be from San Francisco. So there was a way that being from San Francisco, right, the mythical queer space, and that was very important to them, for those who were outside San Francisco. Although for those who were in San Francisco, the fact that they were from that space, like that was also quite important to them, right? That they other places might have it. I might have a problem with this, but I'm from San Francisco, so I'm good, right? I'm tolerant and good, which, you know, as you might guess, turns out to be more complicated than that. I like that though. I like as an ethnographer, I like that. I like noticing like, oh, okay, so if I arrive, like I'm white, lesbian, middle class, middle-aged, right? But I'm not only that, because I'm also from San Francisco. So there's like, I sort of have this virtual boa around me as I move through the space, right? Even as I'm wearing t-shirts and a jean, right? Because they want to be aligned with that. It's kind of exciting. And so I think ethnographically, that feels so important, right? To understand, like, and I'm sure that people in this room understand that, like, who the adult is who's asking the young person to incite, right? That's a resource, it's an obstacle. It's because they also felt accountable to the fabulousness, right? It's not only exciting, it's also, can I live up to that? Am I fabulous enough? And so I want to understand that. And the teachers also, right? The teachers were probably felt more aligned with me because of our age, similarities in age, and so were they fabulous enough, right? We were willing to come into the school and have this booth, and we clearly knew a lot about this, and if they were themselves identifying as queer, and they weren't sure how to identify what box to check, right? Did that mean that they had work to do, right? So there's all sorts of ways that we call not only a story, but particular stories because of who we are. And part of what's interesting to me about that idea of the dress-up box is it might allow a little more distancing. It might allow them to, that might become more apparent to us who they think we're calling them to be, and it might also allow them to alter themselves in response to the call that they think we're issuing them. Yeah.
And I do think that we've talked about it before, but the idea that you would tell a young person that they can go into this hot, private booth and say whatever they want, and that there is no prompt, and you're not interviewing them, and they could stay there as long as they want, and then come out, was something that was really powerful, I think. You know, especially for people, and as people told multiple stories, they sort of relaxed into the idea of it, and how rare it is for the school to endorse that kind of practice. And I think more than anything that the schools, even though it sort of is, it's not anti-pedagogical, but there's a way in which it's non-pedagogical, but the schools were really interested in that because they felt like they recognized that they want young people to participate in their education, but they recognize all the constraints that the school and the structure of schooling places on their participation. And this was like, it's not no constraints, obviously, but it was so freed from so many familiar classroom tropes and techniques and interventions and programs. It sort of just stood there, big and gay, and without anything, you know, and teachers were really worried at first. They were like, young people don't know how to tell a story. You need to tell them how to tell a story so they'll tell you the stories that you think you want to hear. Like, it won't have a beginning, middle, and end, you know, like they wanted us to give example stories. They wanted us to have we did in the first site, like have a list of prompts. Like if you can't think of anything, here's a list of like 15 prompts. Have you heard a gay joke? Who's your favorite gay celebrity or queer celebrity? Have you ever met someone who's trans? You know, like those kinds of things. But students were like, they didn't need that. Yeah.
I think that the teachers, the teachers understood the students' stories as a reflection on them and their school and the work that they were doing.
Yeah.
So everyone was caught in the logic of the school, right? So if our students go in there, what if they don't understand the arc of a narrative and they don't do us proud because these things are going to be shown, and they have to trust us not to take those stories and turn them into evidence that young people can't tell a good story,
or
right?
that your school's terribly homophobic.
Yeah.
You know, they were really worried that students would say bad things, and they, you know, everyone's invested in the school. They love their school. They spend all their time trying to make the school great, and like, what would happen if
I mean, I hadn't even thought about this until right now, but it's in some ways the teachers didn't talk about their lack of trust in us. They talked about their lack of trust in the students, and that in some ways the students had to carry that weight because it was probably much harder for the teachers to tell us, the university researchers, some of us from faculties of education, that they didn't trust us, right? And so that would probably be hard to do. And as is so often the case, young people became the scapegoat, right, for the conflict between adults.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sort of thinking that we're getting to saturation point.
Yes, thank you.
So I'm going to just say.
No, I don't mean that. Thank you. I mean, thank you.
Question will be the last one, and then or whoever, someone thinking of you, and that's it.
Actually, mine is not a question, but I just wanted to thank you both for this wonderful presentation. Because I'm kind of playing with the posthumanism idea, I'm looking at everything through that lens at the moment. And I mean, I'm just appreciating what you are doing also kind of intersect with what you are doing. And just the power of the storytelling, Joan was talking about it as well. And in posthumanism, we talk about, I can't remember, it was Haraway or Rosie Braidotti, when talking about how important it is that how we choose which story we tell, it actually makes everything quite differently, how we understand the world. And it kind of just looking at all these students sharing their experiences kind of remind me about that African proverb about until the lions has his or her own storyteller, the hunter will always have the best part of the story. And I think because you both actually approach the research as they are choosing their own story, and you're not coming in with a pre-made category to them. I felt that the rawness of the experience really kind of came strongly. And as you pointed out, there was how can I say, the commonality as a human experience with the flesh living in this earth, but also it didn't feel like you are generalizing or limiting, but on the other hand, actually it is opening up the possibilities that I am this and that and that and. So for me, it was really powerful and made me think a lot about my own research as well. And I really liked Jessica's comment about how after the participants finish for example, Cody and things like that, thinking about, because we are so, how can I say, entrapped on our own research because of the funding and all those things. But you are asking this question of, he doesn't really need it. I don't think he will really need it. So we keep kind of repositioning yourself that you are very conscious about it. So yeah, you gave me lots to think about. So thank you very much for a wonderful presentation.
Thanks for your comment. Thank you.